I'll be sharing with you a mapping I've been undertaking on the visual studies of the university since the Cold War. The post-Cold War period is of interest because of the massive regulatory changes across the world which affected higher education politics explicitly, such as the Bologna process in Europe, which you would be familiar about, the opening of international trade, including internationalization of higher education, and the amount of context negotiating conflict and legacies of division locally, which were entangled with Cold War interference, support, allegiances, and coalitions. Social struggles that had taken the back seat and were even suppressed during the Cold War came to the surface in these periods. Cognizant of these dynamics and curious of the ways in which they intersected in the visual study of the university, in the period of 1992 to 2023 was selected as a 21-year period, evocative of the coming of age of an area of study. As a critical review that maps the intersection between an area of inquiry and the ocular, the purpose was to explore, note, and represent developments, to unpack evolutionary subtleties, and to shed light on emerging themes and methods. This was to both appreciate the growing strength of trajectories in visual university studies and to surface overlooked and under-researched areas, questions, and methods for future research. As such, it was inclusive of the broad range of study types, intellectual frames, and differing approaches to the visual. What it excluded were those studies where the visual was utilized for university functions, such as education, research, third mission, and citizenry, for therapy, or research translation, what we call pathways to impact these days. We're not inquiring about the university. I call this visual university studies mapping a snapshot of larger research production. Writ large in the absences on this map are publications not in Englishes. This is my limitation, and it means, for instance, that we can't read within these visual university studies the truth-seeking undertaking of universities in Colombia, which had visual components by memory activists. I limited my critical review to journal publications because they're often the testing ground for the new, experimental, and exploratory, and are far more affordable and accessible than book publication for the majority of the world's academics. Journal publications are limited because of that very reason too, so I extended searches outside of the databases and indexing of commercial publishers. I didn't include books, news media, exhibition catalogs, blogs, flyers, nor portfolios, wherein I think there is a treasure trove of knowledge and documentation of visual university studies from creative arts research in particularly. I followed a systematized search process supported by Leanne York, shown here as Researcher 1, and Yvonne Moynihan, Researcher 2, and sifted iteratively through until there were 206 papers that were selected. I'll not be speaking about the journals most published within the left, nor about the prominent authors and their bases within disciplines, institutions, and countries, though I am turning these over and trying to figure things out. I'll instead present a narrative over time, place, thematics, foci, common threads, and challenges. Note that not all studies looked at nation states, nor operated strictly within national borders, particularly as the digital university, virtual activism, and digital archiving has grown. So, in the 1990s, 5 articles focused on student matters that were published, 4 in the United States related to sociocultural tensions, including those which explored, express and exposed issues to do with race, gender, stereotypes held by students of scientists, and the politics of belonging within institutions. The one from Australia is an example of the concern with manufactured image, where the images institutions project about themselves through promotional material raise concerns about growing instrumentality. These feature persistently across the decades. When considering how the visual was positioned within these studies, 2 collected existing photographic imagery, including class pictures and marketing material. The others created conditions for imagery to be generated, produced by student participants for the research, specifically drawings, which were then analyzed, and photographs to elicit reflection, and discussion. Of the 16 published early in this century, 12 revolved around students and then the institution. As with the decade before, there is a clear interest in problematic representation of those marginalized, in these cases due to ableism, patriarchy, and whiteness, including those minoritized in the USA, such as Asian students, and those stereotyped, such as Africans, for promoting study abroad internationalization. Other extramural interests included sport and student protests. The digital world, as object and subject and source of study, grew as the virtual face of institutions through their communication and marketing. Analysis was undertaken of websites, online corporate identity and branding, including of university rankings. I rather like this image of what was at the time the new. Photographs were also sourced and analyzed from analog marketing material, such as viewbooks produced by the US universities to attract the student market. Such critique pits the image the institution projects of itself at odds with its principles, functions, and espoused discourses. The visual was positioned as existing data to be analyzed in 8 papers about artifacts created and published by institutions, and 1 drawing on existing documentation of an event. And generated data included photo elicitations, observations, such as a walking campus tour, and drawing. There was a rapid increase in the 2010s, with 64 publications, growing still in the USA. But you can see many other countries, including South Africa, and also large cross-country studies, which were in the main about the digital or virtual material of institutions. The major concern continued to be about students in 47 papers, but with nuance, including the first-year experience, first-generation status, doctoral students, mature students, and the construction of students as consumers. There was more consideration of academics in 11 of the papers, such as in relation to social structures such as gender, the positioning of academics such as professor, and the construction of academic persona on home pages, which we can see here. Social structures and exclusions, including class, gender, masculinities, gender identities, and race emerge in studies in the majority world again, with this decade seeing the discourse of decolonization in the Western world and about USA Africa study abroad, and 5 papers on indigenous students, specifically Native Americans in the USA. Within the majority world, social exclusions and divisions were broached by looking at minority ethnicities in China and majority groups previously disadvantaged in South Africa. There was a continuation and increase in inquiry about marketing and communication virtually, looking at institutional websites and homepages, social media, particularly concerned with neoliberalism, specifically global rankings, the use of sport in marketing, and about the representation of minorities in terms of the framing of diversity discourses, exposing the manufactured image as a falsehood. As a decade with many social movements and student protests that had an online dimension, the visual study of activism undertaken in the US in visual university studies were about protests in Syria, South Africa, and the USA, and in terms of students' advocacy and coalitions in Canada. Participants' awareness of the politics of image making and framing from their social media content consumption and production was noted as bringing different dynamics to researcher-participant power relations, particularly in terms of interpretation for those undertaking visual studies. The interest in representation as reparation and commemoration of those historically excluded, marginalized, or harmed emerged within campus memorialization. A quick indication of the sources of data collection. This decade saw considerably more variation in data generation. The photograph continued to dominate, but for the most part through photo elicitation and photo voice. Observations were utilized in analog and digital settings, including walking methodologies through campus tours, and in tandem with participant observations of engagement in online social media and protests. The constructed image through mark making, such as drawing, also featured from studies of the stereotypes students held of scientists, drawing such as on the left to express through a focus on narrative and authorship, or explicitly linked to the inclusion of hard to reach and or underrepresented experiences, and academic staff participating in reflective processes through creative forms of data generation using collage, such as on the right, and making postcards. Secondary analysis of the visual study through the creative arts research were published during this period, including a photo essay. Films were analyzed to raise questions about abled academic identity in the popular cultural imagination of the USA, and in this one here, to explore constructions of education, academic citizens, and censorship in the perestroika period of the USSR's Soviet history. The 2020s has seen a boom in visual university studies, with 115 articles published in the first 4 years, and more from the majority world. The decade began with a widening of subjects and foci of paper that focused neither on students or staff, including the digital university, from rankings to the digital campus climate, memorialization within the cultural infrastructure, including Black Lives Matter and decolonization, and concerns, again, about the manufacturing of the facade of universities. The period was also marked by COVID-19 pandemic and its restrictions, with 10 such visual university studies. Continuation of the dark side of the higher education included aspects such as gender justice, looking at sexual violence on campus, sexualized behaviors, collusions, and possible resistance and problematic representation, such as about fake news against Black women in the USA. With the diversification and expansion of visual university studies, one can also observe different interest groups being served by such research. Evaluation for the purposes of increasing efficacy for the student market was one such shift in purpose and discourse of customer behavior, being the student, often utilizing quantitative methods including data mining and recommendations for practice, such as to provide a set of benchmarks on successful communication with the public. And there are also some big cross-country comparative analyses across Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and East Asia to comprehend differences in reception by cultures and nationalities. The dominant trend, however, continued to be critical in orientation, reading against the facade as a form of representation of representing truth against power. For instance, aesthetic communication of academics' images for institutions' public image was demonstrated in the study by Deng and Feng through a critical quantitative visual analysis of 6 of Hong Kong University's annual reports over 2 decades, where the visual identities of academics have shown clear transformations of becoming increasingly individualized, entrepreneurial, and self-promotional, they write. A move from critique, we are not token on the left, to collective cultural resistance by Chicanos and Latino students in a USA campus posed a strong challenge to the false images they saw of diversity in marketing. That example is one of those interesting shifts in this decade towards complicating agency within the digital. Online shifts were noted in audiences' engagements with online platforms as participating forms of datification and knowledge creation. Co-creation is given challenging complexity in a study by McManus, Connell, and Ding of Chinese campus tours of Australian universities as distinctive experience-scapes of heritage architecture, mythology, open space, and educational status, in which universities participate, but cannot determine the nature of social media and content creation by those who aspire to visit the campus, those who profit from such tourism, and the experience of those who share their visits online. Photographs are the main source of data collected, with archives continuing to be explored, from yearbook images to architectural planning materials and architects. artifacts. And then data generation had photo, voice, and elicitation, again, often with other methods, such as combined with walking interviews, participant photo mapping, and then also creative arts processes, which all, interestingly, transgress the murus of the university, such as one which involves students, academics, artists, and homeless people. Represented in this tree map, one can see which thematics have emerged as important across this period of time, in order of quantity, including social exclusion, institutional branding, visual cultural infrastructure, idealization, resistance, memorialization, the extramural, events or happenings, and creative arts expressions. Dotted spaces indicate that in this decade, some areas are definitely increasing. My interest is pulled to the right-hand corner and the underrepresentation of arts research in journal outputs, despite art practice, aesthetic theory, and visual theory having the most appropriate tools theoretically, analytically, and pragmatically for this area. I want to end this by discussing the interest in universities in transition, and I'll show this via 5 papers briefly. The first is the interest in taking from documents of the past to contrast with claims in the present. Here, through genealogical studies on the roots of racism within universities, published in US university yearbooks, ripe for critical visual analysis of image making about the ideal student, top left, contrasts in sports in the bottom, and at the right, the presence that has always been of Black people in US universities, shown here as undertaking labor. Transitions in relation to image projection of institutions is seen here with Chinese university emblems and the changes taken towards and against Western or Eastern attractiveness. Again, an institution's artifact, in this case a document, to look like credentials from a Syrian institution during the uprising in 2011, indicating shifts, even if time-bound, in constructions of the ideal academic citizen and citizenry generally. Here the author looks at colonial institutional relations of land exploitation and sovereignty, first with an archival image in the left from her institutional archive, and then her own series of images taken during habitual walking methodologies of trees marked for removal, and then the stamps at the margin of the campus borderlands, marking the university's violent encroachment on native land, but now in contemporary times. These images are all taken by the author of Student Protests, studying the temporal dimensions of change by looking not at the moment of drama in a journalistic sense of the truth of what happened, but at the minutiae of changes in graffiti, barricade, and detritus after protests and police intervention in Hong Kong universities in 2019. So using the visual purposefully to witness and document something temporal itself, which will be removed from the future of the institution, to add these as markers to the archive. Purposes such as these of the visual in such studies are what I'm turning to next, 11 of which are categorized here, from neoliberal purposes of the institution in marketing efficacy to description, illustration, and the discovery of truth in or via the image, through to more expressive and critical purposes, and then towards the reclamatory, transformative, complex, and uncertain. So definitely an interesting area which I hope you enjoyed exploring a little with me. Thank you.